One second, I'm just recording. So with that, we're going to have Dr. Heckler start. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to talk, and then we'll do a 5-minute Q&A. If it looks like we're not going to get to all of the panelists, we will schedule another session, so don't worry, okay? So Dr. Heckler.
Unmute. All right, let's get started. So I'm going to talk to you today about how to choose a great postdoc experience. I know the audience isn't strictly grad students, but that's what I'll be speaking to today. Okay, so I'll talk about what is a postdoc, what are the different types of postdocs, how do you find a position, how do you make a decision, and how can you set yourself up for success in your postdoc training. So I'm going to start by pointing out some data. So this is from Future of Research, and this graphic comes from the Cell Biology ASCB. So about 70 to 80% of biology PhDs do a postdoc. Most postdocs have primary faculty career choice. And then in year 2 or 3, once you've gotten to know something a little bit more about different careers, done some career exploration, or your values and interests have changed, most postdocs at that point have picked a different career as their primary career choice. So a postdoc is really a temporary mentored training period where you're preparing for the career path of your choice. So before you even start thinking about whether or not you want to do a postdoc, it's really important to set up your goals. So what are your research goals? What are your career goals? What are your personal goals? Do you have an individual development plan? If you don't, that's a good place to get started on thinking about what are your goals, what are your skills, interests, and how do they align with careers and your values? And then what kind of environment do you need to support those goals? So really, compared to graduate school and things you've done in the past where there's very set timelines and milestones, in a postdoc, it's really what you make it. So there's different types of postdocs. Most people are familiar with postdocs in academia, so public-private university. There's also research institutes that aren't educational institutions, but they do a lot of research. Then there's industry and business postdocs, government and federal agencies, government labs, and then nonprofits. And then within that, there's different types of postdocs. So most people are familiar with research postdocs, most in basic science, but there's different types. There's a lot of things that are changing in postdoc training. It's an exciting time to be involved in postdoc training. So there's postdocs specifically for people who are interested in higher education administration, communication, writing, public policy, science policy, IP, etc. At the same time, you could be doing a basic science research postdoc and get experience in these fields as well. You know, in particular, WashU has a TL1 program that accepts postdocs who are interested in innovation and basically like startups and things like that in the St. Louis region. Specifically, they work a lot with the Cortex. So how do you find a postdoc position? It's never too early to start thinking about it and start talking to people, networking, building relationships, reaching out to people whose research you're interested in just to learn more. Make sure that you're discussing your career plans and your progress with your graduate school mentors, using your IDP, with career advisors, so everyone has access to the Career Center. They have dedicated advisors for grad students and postdocs, and their experience in advising around a variety of careers. Professional societies, your personal network. Ask questions, meet new people, follow up. Then when you're ready to start applying, start identifying places your research groups you're interested in early and often. It's totally reasonable to start inquiring 12 months in advance, 6 months in advance. It's okay if it's been a difficult year for everyone in research, so it's okay if you don't think that you're ready, you know, start making those connections and inquiries. Identify independent funding sources. Make sure that you're doing research on the lab that you're interested in, that you know about their research generally, and then make sure that you're following up. And then I have a list here of all the places that you can look for positions, so I'm happy to share these slides and you can check those out. So how to make a decision, hopefully you've had time to think about your goals and how those might align with different places. So in addition to the type of research and the type of institution you want to be at, you want to think about what kind of management style or mentoring philosophy works best for your mentoring needs. What kind of primary mentor would you work best with? The mentorship history of your future primary faculty mentor, talk to grad students and postdocs, and think about what are your expectations for your postdoc? What are you looking to get out of it? What do you need to be successful? And also think about benefits like compensation, cost of living, resources. WashU is a great place to do a postdoc because we have a lot of resources for postdocs that other institutions don't have. Funding opportunities, so you can look up funding of research groups you're interested in, or how many postdocs have fund their individual fellowship at that institution by using NIH Reporter or the NSF database. Make sure that there's opportunities for networking and that you'll be able to travel to conferences in your postdocs. It's really important to build your independent research career. Then you want to look at resources and policies. Our postdoc association here, of course, is great. Other institutions have really great postdoc associations, that there's career and professional development support, and that you can find a community there. So you might have personal considerations that you want to think about, where you're going to live. Does that support for your life exist? And so on our prospective postdocs website, we have a section on choosing a postdoc position. There is a really great, very large PDF of all the questions you should ask and who you should ask those questions to when you're thinking about choosing a postdoc. I recommend using that. That was created by a postdoc for grad students who are thinking about postdoc position. How do you set yourself up for success? Again, for the third time, I'm going to say create an individual development plan. So make sure you're doing that, you're revisiting it, talking with your primary mentor about that, about your research and career goals. Build a mentoring network, reach out to peers, secondary mentors that can help you with your career and professional goals. I recommend spending 20% of your time on career and professional development activities. That's based on what the NIH NRSA says in their training programs. For support, join a postdoc association, another campus group. I know a lot of our grad students are really active in the really great campus groups we have here. A lot of other institutions also have those kinds of things, or other community support. And then lastly, I have here the National Postdoc Association's core competencies. Those are recommendations of the core competencies that postdocs should be gaining throughout their training. So again, that's on the National Postdocs, Prospective Postdocs webpage, and they have a lot of great resources there, as well as a guide to choosing a postdoc. So a lot of things to think about. And so this is a really brief overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or feel free to reach out anytime. So the postdoc website is postdoc.wustl.edu, and all of our contact information is there.
Anybody have any questions? Got 5 minutes. So.
Hi, my name is Matthew. My question is, do you have any data on where most people meet their future postdoc advisors, or kind of through what means?
No, I don't. I don't think anyone does, because postdocs don't go through a central application process, basically at any institution, including here. A lot of the way that people find their postdoc position is through networking or answering a national job ad, but there isn't really any solid data on how postdocs find a position, or even where they don't go through a central application process. So I don't have any internal data either.
I have a question. What's an intellectual property postdoc?
Yeah, so they might work with the Office of Tech Management here. So I don't think we have here a formalized program besides the TL1 program in that space. But I know postdocs who have worked with OTM on kind of like a side project, or they have IP in their you know, if they work in engineering, they might have a medical device they're working on. So they're learning about IP while they're doing their postdoc.
Or maybe are they just at a law firm?
No, typically they're working with within the institution. So the Office of Technology Management, OTM.
Yeah, so within WashU, we can you can do it through OTM, you can actually do it through the Center for Drug Discovery or CRIB, or there's actually an opportunity where you can devote a percentage of your time to a project that you're on through a conventional postdoc, and then a different percentage of your time working on how would that be commercialized. And that's through the TO1 program here.
I do know that OTM here, you know, has taken on postdocs or you know, other those in those roles, and they've, you know, spent 6 months or a year usually shadowing someone. They may be given a responsibility for a project or two. You know, they certainly get plenty of guidance. But then both the individuals that I know went on to, you know, into industry after that and continued with that area. So there's some value there for sure.
Any other questions? Okay, well, we'll move on. And if a question does come up, Erin's still going to be here throughout the hour, so we can ask questions later. The next person that will be presenting will be Dr. Alex Holehouse, and he'll be talking about positions in academia.
Indeed. What I wanted to, before I kind of get into this, I thought it's useful to provide a bit of context as to why I am or am not qualified to talk about sort of this question. And it's fair to say you could argue that I'm not actually that well qualified, both because I'm relatively junior as a faculty member, but also because I've had a pretty atypical career trajectory. And for those of you who don't know, I did my PhD in the DBBS biochemistry program here, and then my postdoc also here in the Department of Biomedical Engineering before moving over to start my lab about a year ago. That sort of staying at the same institution is pretty uncommon, and it's not necessarily something I would recommend, but I'm sort of happy to talk to people about that offline if people are interested in that particular decision. On the flip side though, in kind of going through this process, and I applied to a variety of different positions when I applied, I sort of felt like it was my duty to learn up on this because I had this sort of very atypical experience and people were asking me for advice. And so I sort of thought I should actually have some sense of how to do this correctly. And so I was on the job market in the 2018-2019 cycle. And you know, amongst, you know, actually experiencing it and living through that, I've done some sort of actual academic work on this as well. So we published a paper last year. This is a paper that we published in eLife. We did sort of a large scale survey of applying to academic jobs and what that process was like. I'm not going to talk about any of that data today, but that's available there. And we have a follow-up policy paper that actually Natalie Niemi in the department is the corresponding author on, that's just kind of going through the process of getting published now as well. And in that context as well, over the last year or so, I've organized a number of kind of academic job market webinars. And so there's a lot of different aspects to this. And today I'm really going to focus on the very practical side of what is the process of applying for these jobs and what are these jobs like, as opposed to the much harder and longer question of what is the best way to do it. And so kind of before we get into this, I think it's important to take a step back and say what type of faculty jobs sort of are there, sort of academic faculty jobs. And there are kind of two broad classes. There are tenure track jobs, and these are jobs that kind of nominally have a long-term probation period, I guess you could think about it. So this is typically somewhere between 5 and 10 years, where at the end of that, that's sort of the tenure clock or the tenure period, at the end of which you either get a permanent position, and that's a long-term contract that, barring you don't do anything kind of outrageous, is in principle a job for life, or you sort of don't get tenure and you have to go and find a different job somewhere else in some other capacity. And those sort of tenure track jobs are found at universities, and I'm classing universities here very broadly as institutions. These can be public or private, these can be research heavy or research light, but these are institutions that have both graduate students and undergraduates. And your role in that capacity there would be both to do research to some extent, but also to teach to some extent. And the balance between those two things will vary from institution to institution substantially. There are also medical schools and research institutes, and these are sort of research-heavy institutions that don't necessarily have a large or potentially any teaching component to that job at all. And then there are jobs at primarily undergraduate institutions. So these are institutions, sort of small liberal art colleges or community colleges that don't have a sort of large research program, and your role there is primarily to teach and to foster research done by undergraduates as well. There's also sort of a second set of jobs, which are these non-tenure track positions, and these are much more varied, and they really depend on the institution, the job, the requirements. And these can be both research heavy, so these can be sort of research assistant professor track roles, or they can be kind of more teaching heavy, where you're there really as an instructor to teach kind of full time. And again, this set of jobs are a bit more variable and depend really on the needs of any given institution. So these kind of vary from year-to-year contracts to kind of these sort of well-defined positions where you may have a job for 5 years with a large startup, but on the understanding that it's not going to transition into a tenure track position. And there are some institutions that have these kind of early career type positions that are nominally non-tenure track, but are sort of very research heavy, and in many ways, functionally, what you're doing is the same thing as you might be if you were on a tenure track. So a second kind of important feature then is sort of when do you apply to this, and in North America, so the US and Canada specifically, there's a pretty well-defined timeline and calendar to what this looks like, and this is sort of broadly or colloquially referred to as the academic job cycle, and this sort of involves applying typically in the September, October, November time. This is when different positions will open and there'll be deadlines for job applications. You then will interview either over Zoom and or in person in December, January, February, March, and then that start date, if you're successful in acquiring a position, can be somewhat flexible. So typically it's going to be in the summer after you interview for that year, but oftentimes places will be happy for you to defer a year to start 6 months later. There's some flexibility in terms of the actual start date, but the actual cycle is reasonably well defined. That being said, there are also sort of off-cycle postings that can happen. So sometimes institutions will realize they need someone to fill a specific role, or a search didn't complete or failed, and they can kind of try and sneak in an extra kind of off-cycle search here. And this typically will happen towards the middle of the spring, and at least in anecdotal experience happens when institutions realize they need to hire someone else for a specific role, as opposed to just kind of generally saying we'd like to add someone to our faculty. Just as a word of caution, because this seemed like the best place to bring this up, people often apply to a lot of positions, and this really reflects the fact that for any given position, you may have 200, 300, 400 applicants, and that's quite an overwhelming set of odds. And so, on the paper that we published last year, the median number that people apply to is 15, but a median is an average from a non-Gaussian distribution. So the maximum we had was someone who applied for 250 jobs, and that might seem extreme, but in a sort of apocryphal tale, I know personally of multiple people who applied for hundreds of positions. And so this is maybe not common, but it's not super rare either. And so I think that's something just to bear in mind, depending on your goals and your objectives professionally. This is not something that's completely out of the question. There are also sort of non-tenure track jobs, as I mentioned, and these typically are much more flexible in terms of the hiring and start date and application. So these are posted kind of as they are needed throughout the year, depending on the needs of a given institution. For teaching-focused jobs, these normally end up being in the spring with the goal of you starting then in the following September. But again, this can be something that's sort of somewhat flexible. So how do you find these jobs? And so, typically speaking, there are a number of sort of job websites or job boards where academic jobs are posted to. And the two main ones that I use when I was applying and that most people tend to use are Science Careers and Nature Jobs. And sort of functionally how this works is that institutions that want to post a job will pay to have a job ad posted in these different places. And these are kind of the general places you can go to find listings for jobs, both tenure track and non-tenure track as well. But in addition, obviously, this is kind of a general place that collates multiple different jobs from many different places. If there are specific institutions you're interested in, it's really a good idea to go to the websites of specific departments or to the HR websites for those specific institutions as well. And at some level, if there's somewhere you really want to go, the best thing is just to talk to people, is to email and contact people at those institutions, or maybe and ask them, are you planning on doing a search this year? Are you hiring? Because sometimes there'll be places that aren't necessarily advertising, but maybe thinking about hiring as well. And so just talking to people, if you have some kind of connection to the institutions, is a good idea if you're trying to do a targeted search for a specific geographical location. on a practical level, what goes into an application for a tenure track position? So there are sort of a number of different components that are relatively common from position to from posting to posting. These typically involve a cover letter. That's common with standard with pretty much any job. This is describing who you are at a very high level, why you think you'd be a good fit for that institution or that department. There's a research statement. This is kind of the meat of your application. This is typically 2 to 3 pages. Most places will give you some guidance on how long it should be. If they don't, I wouldn't go above 3 pages. As I mentioned, if you're on the search committee and you're reviewing 200 applications, the difference between 3 pages and 4 pages is a lot of pages. So keeping it short is typically on the better. You certainly could fill 10 pages, I'm sure, but that's not the goal. The goal is to provide a succinct description of what your goals are. And that research statement should typically be split somewhere around 25% talking about what you've done and why you're the bee's knees, and what you're going to do and why you think you're going to kind of have an impact in your field of choice. You also need letters of recommendation. Typically, this ends up being somewhere between 3 and 5 letters. Again, it will vary a little bit from posting to posting. And then depending on the job, many positions at universities, very common, but even some sort of medical schools will ask for a teaching statement or a teaching philosophy statement. And this is really to discuss kind of your experience doing teaching, how you go about teaching, things you'd be interested in teaching. And depending on the role of the position, this can be more or less important. And increasingly as well, there's now a requirement for these diversity statements. And these are sort of an opportunity for you to talk about how what you're doing in your kind of general interaction with a department or an institution is going to improve and increase its diversity. And this is something that the UC schools, in California, made a requirement a number of years ago, and many other schools have started doing this as well. And it's a really kind of good move towards recognizing sort of a disparity between the national demographics and the demographics within science and technology and engineering. So what are the typical timelines of applying? So normally what happens is you apply in kind of September, October, and then you hear nothing. And the sad reality, and this is one of the things that we kind of found in this survey that we did, is that the vast majority of jobs you apply for, you get excited, you write this application, you put all this work in, and you hit submit, and that's it. You never hear anything again, which is extremely demoralizing. But that's, I'm saying this only to say, though, it's not you. That's just unfortunately how it is, and there are moves to try and make that better, but unfortunately that's still the reality right now. If you do hear back, typically you'll hear, within the first sort of 6 weeks to 2 to 3 months, and that will normally involve some kind of email and then a Zoom or Skype interview, and that will typically be a 15 to 30 minute process. And then on average, 5 to 10 people for any given search will be invited to the institution to give a seminar in January, February, and March. And then from that set of people who give seminars, someone will be made an offer, and they'll be given the opportunity to come and have a second visit to go and kind of see the institution and meet people now on their terms. So previously, if you're interviewing, you're trying to convince them to take you. Now you're going when you have the power, so it's a little bit of a different dynamic. Think about space, where your lab might be, and then you would hopefully accept that position and typically start sort of sometime thereafter. I'll just end with a couple of bits of very practical advice. I mean, this is something that it could be an entire series of seminars, so I won't go into too much detail. But the first thing I would say is to start early. This process is an incredibly slow process. You may think you have a great idea of how to write a fantastic research statement. You may well have one, but putting that down in a coherent way that's going to be clear and succinct to people outside your field is really difficult and requires multiple steps of iteration and multiple sets of feedback. I'll say again, start early. I can't emphasize this enough. The number of people I know who have missed cycles because they've started kind of later in the summer and realized that they're nowhere near prepared to get this done, anecdotally, at least from my experience, is high. And it really, getting this down and starting to flesh out the contours of this early on is a really good idea. And by early, I guess I should sort of qualify this. By early, I mean sort of in the spring of the year you're going to be applying. So if you're going to apply for a job in September, don't start in August. Start sort of substantially before that in terms of getting things together. The other thing that I think is absolutely critical is get as many people outside of your field as possible to read your application. The chances of someone being on a search committee who understands and knows what you do is very, very low. There have been many, many committees. So you need to be writing your application in a way that's lucid and clear and gets to the point of why what you're doing is important, and not assume that anyone's going to understand or believe that from the outset. And then the final thing I'll say, based on discussion with people who have served on committees, is that job ads, job postings are often deliberately vague. And so you should sort of not be dissuaded because you don't necessarily feel like your work fits or doesn't fit into a specific category. Instead, typically ads are worded with some kind of idea in mind about what a department might want, but ultimately the departments are looking for the best candidates they can get. And so if you really think you'd be a good fit for a given department or a given institution, you should say that, you should sell that, and you shouldn't worry too much about the obvious fit from the text. With that, I would just say there's also this Future PI Slack group, which is as it sort of suggests, is a Slack group of sort of postdocs who are, and graduate students, but mostly postdocs who are planning to apply for faculty jobs. And this is a really fantastic resource for getting information on that process. And then finally, I'll say I'm happy to answer any questions over email, over Zoom, and I'm happy to read people's proposals. I've done this for a lot of people over the last couple of years. And I think it's a really useful thing to have people who are broadly read in the scientific literature to read over and think about what you're trying to say and if it's coming across or not. So I'd be happy to do that if anyone is interested in that. And so with that, I'll close, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
That's great, Alex. Thank you. Does anybody any postdocs have a question?
Thank you, Alex. Can I ask you a question? Sure. I want to know when you apply your independent academic position. At that time, did you get your some grant at that time, and how you apply the grant? Because I think money is one important to support your application, right?
Yeah, so it varies a little bit from institution to institution. So I know of examples of institutions who say, we're not even going to interview you if you don't come with funding, right? Which is, I think, a fairly closed-minded approach, but I know, like, categorically, like, this happened to a friend of mine in the last few weeks. So those places do exist. Many institutions will typically say, you know, if you have money or if you have a grant, that's great, but it's not necessarily a requirement for coming. And you know, I didn't really get into this, but the eLife paper that I kind of mentioned, our goal in doing that was to try and figure out what features were the things that determined success in applying for jobs. Because this was really the question we set out to ask, which is that this is a very sort of Byzantine and opaque process, right? You know, thousands of people submit job applications, a tiny handful get offers. What is determining success versus failure? And the slightly unsatisfying conclusion from that really is that there's no one path to being successful, right? Some people come in with a K award, with prestigious sort of fellowships from their PhD, with many high impact papers, and are not successful. Some people come in with none of those things and are successful. There's a lot of stochasticity in the process that kind of integrates what do departments want, what are they looking for, are you a good fit? I mean, I think from the department's perspective, fit is a really important thing, which, you know, how well will you integrate into that set of people? The challenge is that's one of the hardest things to evaluate for you as an applicant, if you will be a good fit if you don't know a department. So it's a difficult situation, but I don't think, you know, on average, having a K award is probably helpful, but it is in general not going to be necessary, other than in sort of some circumstances, which I don't think are necessarily the norm.
Okay, thank you, Alex. It's very helpful for me. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions? Okay, so we will move on, and I will correct my introduction and reintroduce Dr. Ron Dolle and Dr. Mike Kinch. I was trying to do two things at the same time at the beginning, and they will talk about industry. So I will give it to both of them. I don't know if they decided which order, but now we'll hear from Mike and Ron.
I guess I can start out. Yeah, I think Erin and Alex have done a really great job setting the stage here for this. There's a lot of commonality between what you've described and things that happen in industry and applying for jobs in industry. I've got just a couple of notes here. I guess the first question you'd want to ask yourself is, you know, why do you want to work in industry? You know, is that something that you really want to do? Do you like the academic environment? Do you like pursuing your own ideas and creativity in that way? And when you're in industry, it's a different mindset there. Those companies are product driven. So when you're hired into a company, you'll find yourself on a team. Now, whether that's, I came in through the research side. I was in pharmaceutical industry for about 30 years and in drug discovery. But you'll come in there and you'll be on a project team. And that project team has some very specific goals. Now, those projects are very well funded generally, especially if you're the big pharmaceutical companies. But it's a different mindset from what you'd find in academic setting. And so with that in mind, knowing that you're going to be part of a project, and whether that's a research project, whether that's something that has to do with IP or a number of other satellite industries associated with the pharmaceutical and biotech industries, they're looking to hire somebody with an expertise. So you've got your graduate degree and you've done some graduate research, and then you go on to postdoc and you specialize a little bit, obviously, in a particular area, but you're developing expertise. And so when you go out looking for a position, right, you're going to be marketing your skill set. And it's the company that you find a match with your skill set and what they're looking for is an opportunity there to be hired. You're coming in there and you'll be doing a specific job, probably for a good 3 to 5 years, part of that research or that, that particular team and that project. And one thing nice about industry is that you can go in on the research side, but there is a huge number of opportunities within the industry to do other things. So you might get involved in project management where you're looking in charge of a team that's trying to move a product, in this type, say a drug, toward clinical trials. You might find yourself into a regulatory environment, working with the feds to try to get a drug approved or a product approved. And there's a whole list of things that you can become involved with. And a lot of people that do go into industry, their job will evolve over time. Now, you can certainly go in and you can stay on the research track if you want. There are people that have developed some fantastic scientific reputations and they're research fellows in organizations. But then there's also this management track. So you're in the lab, you're working on this project for 5 years or so, and then you have a chance to branch out, maybe in management or do something different. And then I guess I would say that the other thing to consider too is in terms of finding positions, I think network is really the key. And the reason why I say that is that the statistics are there. This is first-time job seekers, that 95% of the jobs that are successfully landed, there's been some connection with somebody, either first connection or second connection with somebody inside the company that you're seeking to apply to. And, you'll want to reach out to that person and make sure that your resume or your CV ends up in front of the hiring manager, because, there are hundreds and hundreds of resumes and job applications coming in for any one position that's listed in industry. And you want to be able to distinguish yourself. And one way to do that, if there's somebody there that can pull your resume out of the pile and present that to the hiring manager. So it's a good idea to know who, people that you're working with in your graduate career now, other students and postdocs that you run in when you do that career, and find out where these people go and develop a most extensive network as you possibly can, because you're going to rely on those people to help you potentially get your CV and get your foot in the door. So networking is important. And I guess the last thing too is just when you're thinking about a position in industry, it's important to think about geographic location. So if you're going to be located here and you want to stay in St. Louis or the Midwest, That's going to sort of limit your space that you'll do your job search. Maybe you're a little more adventurous and you'd like to go to California, San Francisco area, something like that. Or perhaps you'd like to go to Boston, which is basically the biotech nexus of the world right now. And there's lots and lots of opportunity for research scientists of all backgrounds to have employment opportunities there. So that's something that you want to consider too, is build up your network as a graduate student, as a postdoc, develop a specific expertise, market yourself in that respect, and then when you're interviewing, they're not only interviewing you, but you're also interviewing the company, and that you would like to make sure that the culture there sort of fits in line and you feel comfortable the best you can during the interview process. And a little bit like the looking for academic positions, you can expect having a first interview, which you will give a seminar, and you'll meet with your prospective boss and some of his associates, and they'll interview you all day long. There's all types of questions, scientific questions, behavioral questions that you might be asked. And then at the end of the day, these groups get together and they talk about the candidate, what they liked about the candidate, what they didn't like the candidate, how that candidate compares to others that they've seen or others that they're planning on bringing in to do the interview. So a highly competitive process. You'll generally go back for a second interview. It might just be a half a day, but you'll go back for a second interview, because if they're really serious about hiring you, they may want to have you meet other people in the organization, just to have you get exposure before you go in there. So it's about, I guess I'll just stop there. Really, it was just some points here to stimulate conversation, really.
So do you want me to start, or do you want to take questions to Ron before I begin?
You can go ahead, since you're the same topic. Go ahead, Mike, and then we can take questions for both of you at the end.
Okay, thanks. So one thing you may have noticed was that neither Ron nor I prepared slides. And I would argue it's not because the two of us are lazy, although one could argue that I'm sitting on a couch, and so perhaps that's not the case. But it's probably because when you look at folks that tend to go into industry, they tend to be very flexible and nimble. And you tend to sort of react to the moment, because the moment is always changing. And you could argue that's the case in any sort of profession, but I think especially in industry, it's crucial. And it points out a couple of things to think about. One is that if you think about positions in large companies and small companies, they're quite different. But there is one thing that does unify them, and that is, and this is not meant in a way that is a negative, but it's just very frank, which is that when you were being hired by a company, the key question is, how are you going to make me money or save me money? And I've had probably 300 or 400 different reports, either that I've been responsible for hiring or managing, just in the past 20 years or so. And for those who don't know my background, I've spent about half my life in academia, about half my life in industry, and I kind of keep ping-ponging back and forth. But that how are you going to make me money or save me money is really crucial. Now, frankly, it's also true in academia. That same question applies, but it's more in your face in industry. And it's something to keep in mind. How are your experiences? How are your capabilities? How are your techniques going to work to the benefit of the company to either make them money or save them money? Perhaps do a process better refers to saving money. The other thing to keep in mind, or another thing to keep in mind, is that large companies and small companies have a very different approach to things. In a large company, you may become a deep expert in a particular area. And that is important because in a large company where perhaps you have dozens or hundreds of people working on a particular project, you need to be an ultra expert in a particular thing. That's very different than in a small company. And I've kind of had experiences in both worlds. At MedImmune, I had a department that was of 60 or 70 people just for the cancer biology, preclinical cancer biology work. Whereas I was at another company called Functional Genetics, where there were a dozen of us that were responsible for 5 different programs and the IND enabling activities for all of these different programs. So you're looking for different things. When I was at a small company, I needed someone that was, again, going to be nimble and flexible and able to learn on the fly, to do things they had never been trained to do, but that they had the capacity to do that. And so I think that's very different than when, for example, I was at MedImmune and I had one person who was going to be in charge of doing, for example, surface plasmon resonance, Biochor. And that I wanted someone that was very specialized in a technique, and so had that experience or had the ability to adapt. Another thing to keep in mind about industry, and this is a little bit different than academia, is that you hear a lot about how a vice president will come walking in and say, we're not going to do this project anymore, we're going to do these others. Well, in general, that doesn't mean they're going to lay off 3/4 of the staff. It generally means they're going to expect the staff they already have to be able to do this different thing. And so that gets to that nimbleness, as well as the flexibility. How quickly and how efficiently can you readapt to a new program? If you're moved from one program to another, what is your capability of doing that? There are frankly some people that like to do one thing or focus in one area and not change. That's probably not going to work very well in industry unless you are lucky enough to land one of those technical jobs. For example, we talked about Biochor, that allows you to do this for a long period of time. But again, that's very rarely the case. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. So it's, again, it all boils down to that. How are you going, sorry, I've got some background noise. How are you going to make me money or save me money? And if you're asking the question, well, how do I know how I'm going to make the money or save the money, and how do I even begin? One thing I would recommend would be to start with a website like LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is a great way to begin that networking. It's a virtual networking, but let's face it, nowadays, that's the only networking that there is. But get an idea, both, first of all, convey what your skills are, what your potential to make someone money or to save them money, but also look around at perhaps people that you aspire to become or aspire to work for, and look at not just what are their capabilities, which you can get from papers, but what have been their experiences? Where did they begin? So if you want to, Lord forbid, become a Michael Kinch or a Ron Dolle, go to LinkedIn and say, well, where was Michael Kinch and Ron Dolle? Track their jobs and see where they went. And so I think having that kind of a background and coming in with that open-mindedness to say, okay, I'm going to have to be adaptable. My careers are going to change. And coming in with that mindset is really the difference between someone who's going to succeed in industry and someone who's not, because you've got to have that flexibility. And I know for one, when I was a postdoc, frankly, didn't have that degree of flexibility. If you follow my career, just as an example, I have radically changed my career about 5 times in my life. And I bear no resemblance to what I was trained to do. And so having that flexibility is really crucial. And I think I'll leave it at that and say that, you know, any questions around that would be great.
Does anybody have any questions? That was great. All of our panelists did an awesome job. So yeah, so thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions for Mike and Ron or any of the other panelists right now?
Hi, it's Matt again. I have a question, I guess, for Mike and Ron. You mentioned the geographical constraints. What are some ways that you recommend trying to expand one's network? Because if you're interested in like going to other geographical locations, right? We're in St. Louis, like how would you recommend trying to build network with people in Boston or, you know, Texas or California, just places that are farther away rather than like Chicago, which might be closer and easier?
Well, one thing that you could do is, let's say you're interested in Boston, for example. You know, there are hundreds and hundreds of biotech companies there. All the major pharmaceutical companies now have hubs there, if that's something you're interested in. What I would do is I would identify maybe 25, let's say, 24 industries, 24 companies you're interested in, and doing some research on those and finding out who in those companies are doing the type of work that you are skilled to do and you're interested in doing. And can you then find a second degree connection. Somebody could maybe introduce you to that person if you don't know them, and you could get some additional information. But I would start with doing some research there, identifying companies you want to work with, and then drilling down using LinkedIn. You can look at employee profiles on a lot of the companies, particularly if you're in research. A lot of companies will promote publishing. There are some companies that don't do that, but you can get an idea from types of publications and work that they're doing. That might be a place to start.
Yeah, I'll just add, taking off from what we heard at the Newly Four Sigma talks, I wanted to make the point there that we've had a lot of alums go to Sigma. I could tell you half a dozen people that you could go talk to there. And Ron's right, the way to figure out who these people are is to see their profiles on LinkedIn or on other social media, Twitter or Facebook. You find them because of those connections. And then you either frankly approach them and say, this is what I'm doing, would you give me advice? Or you could just try to engage them in a more informal way. And I think I do see this a lot. I mean, I'm constantly, not a lot, but I do interact with a lot of people, including young people or people that I've never met who are in the same field or who have common interests because we are tweeting and posting about similar things. So I've sort of come to know people who I wouldn't otherwise have known.
And frankly, geography has become much less of a restriction, largely because of COVID-19. And whereas in the past, if you weren't in Boston or South San Francisco, you might as well not even try. That's very much not the case with now what we've learned about distance learning. Now, obviously being in a laboratory is very different. But I would also argue there is an interesting thing that had already been going on, but was very much catalyzed by COVID-19. And that is that you had a lot, for example, of tech companies that might have been in Boston or South San Francisco that are saying, this is too expensive, we need to get out of here. And we had already seen examples of that. For example, Square's decision to move to St. Louis was an example. And when they were asked, why did they do this? The answer shocked me, at least, and it was water. It boiled down, pardon the pun, to water. That a lack of water was driving up the costs of everything for that company, even though it's not exactly a company you would think would be dependent upon that. But my point being that gain that experience that at the end of the day will help them make money or save money. There are many opportunities for startup companies to get a breadth of experience. You'll get breadth, but not necessarily depth. And there are other cases where you'll get depth, but not breadth. And if you're strategically planning your career, which is sometimes works to your advantage and sometimes doesn't, you may want to go back and forth between getting breadth in certain areas and depth in others, and then going, again, shuttling back and forth between those to try to anticipate not what does the job market need today, but where's the job market going to be 2 years from now? And so one good thing about COVID-19 is I think the breadth, depth, and the geography have all been thrown up in the air as a consequence of the pandemic.
I'd say one last thing too, don't be afraid to lean on the faculty here. People like myself, Mike, John, he just mentioned he knows a lot of people at Sigma. We all have contacts. I worked at GSK, I was at Merck, Sanofi, a couple of biotech companies during my career, and I've got people everywhere. So it could certainly help you out if you're getting serious about a particular company or a location.
I just want to jump in with some campus resources. So the Career Center has a really vast alumni network. They have a job search acceleration team. The person who runs that has helped postdocs and grad students find a lot of, so she's a huge network. That's a really good place to start. And they can also help you with resources of how to reach out to people and conduct, essentially what we're talking about is informational interviews to get to know people and their careers. And last, just building on what Ron said, just start talking to people because you don't know you wouldn't know Ron's full history unless you talk to him, and then you would get to know the people he knows and the people they know. And so just talking to people about what your research or your career goals are is a good place to start.
Yeah.
And a key,
you know, for a while, we've called Genentech WashU West. It's unbelievable the number of people from WashU that have gone to Genentech.
So something else to keep in mind is that a big difference between industry and academia, although frankly, 2 of the 3 academic jobs I've ever had in my life was through this mechanism, is what's known as headhunters or recruiters. And recruiters, especially early to mid-career, are essential. And these are folks who work for the company, whose job it is to identify candidates for these open positions. And again, to make the company money or save the company money. And the thing I think that's crucial to understand about recruiters is that they are about a half step above a used car salesperson. And I mean that in every cynical way in which it can be meant. And that they're paid for and they make their money from the company, not the candidates. And so that's really important to understand. And again, we could spend a lot of time talking about recruiters, but it's by registering in LinkedIn and other things like that, you will actually the recruiters will become aware of you. And so it's another reason to do that. And if you're, entertaining the possibility of entering the private sector.
The other thing about networking is that, you want to tell everyone in your network, right? Your fellow students, your postdocs, your mentors, people in the department that you're looking for a job and what type of job you're looking for in industry. And, I get calls all the time from headhunters. I'm sure a number of other people do too. But you say you have a friend of yours, a colleague there who, headhunter just called, him or her out of the blue. They could say, well, I'm not really interested. I'm not on the market anymore, but I know so-and-so who is, and they'll pass your contact information on to that person and they'll give you a call. So the network really is critical. You want to do the best job you can there. And I would reiterate with something that Alex said too, start early. You want to be able to build up that network. And then one last thing is there's so many pieces to this, but while you're in industry or you're in biotech, once you have a job, maintain that network, because especially in biotech, you're product driven, you're getting to say a clinical trial or something, it goes bust, the company closes. In fact, if you're in biotech, there's 1 of 2 things happen, is that it either doesn't do well, it's unsuccessful and you're out of a job or you're looking for another job, or it's amazingly successful and it gets bought by a company and they're not interested in research, they're interested in the product. So you could find yourself back out looking for a job again. So you want to maintain a lifelong network, and then be sure to reciprocate too. So you want to be able to help someone else find positions.
So I think I have a question from Casey, which would be that it's kind of more of a existential question, because I think we've talked a lot about, the actual mechanism of just applying and when to apply. And, maybe it would just be like, how do you, if when going to a postdoctoral position, what's the best way, and there might be many different answers for this, but to set yourself up for like the best training opportunity? Like, is it when looking for a postdoctoral position, there's kind of so many different options, but there's probably, a probability that some will be better for that particular person than others. And maybe kind of to narrow down my question would be like, was there anything that maybe either you on the board kind of really made your postdoctoral training really something that was benefited you past that?
Yeah, I can speak to that, both personally and as a postdoc office administrator. That a lot of times you know, you're writing your thesis, you're so glad to be done, you just want to go into the next thing. You're thinking strictly about the research fit and not so much about the mentorship fit or other kind of support you need. And you're right, there are a lot of options. So if you're going to do a postdoc, you think you want to go towards the faculty track, but you have maybe some other ideas, you know, make sure you're going somewhere that has resources for that. So you know, obviously I use WashU as an example. We have a really great career center with dedicated advisors that know how to advise postdocs. There's a lot of different campus groups like BALSA, Future Educators that you can get involved in that will help prepare you for teaching career or consulting. And then we have awesome departments that hold events like this. So you want to think about what you need and what you want besides just the research fit. So I would reference again that webpage we have on prospective postdocs and choosing a postdoc. That PDF that a past postdoc created is about 10 pages long, and it has what are all the questions you should ask your primary faculty mentor? What should you ask trainees who were in the lab, trainees who used to be in the lab? What should you ask about resources? It has a wide range of questions. But I will say the main thing is do some self-reflection, do an individual development plan, or meet with a career advisor to talk through what your goals are if you're not really sure what those are. Because that's you know, what they're there for, is to help guide you through that process. And then there's a lot of really exciting things happening around postdoc training. And you know, obviously we do a lot of great stuff. But there's a thing called the Postdoc Academy, which is an NIH funded program. And so they created courses for postdocs. And the first one they created is Succeeding as a Postdoc. So when you start your postdoc position, take a course like that. It really walks you through the process of why are you doing a postdoc? What do you need to get out of it? And how are you gonna do that? So it's a lot to think about, but just thinking about it and getting started is a great place to start. And I'm happy to meet with anyone one-on-one to talk through that.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask very, very quickly, primarily just for the industry people, how valuable do you see postdocs and postdocs in general before entering the industry field? Or what's the best thing that you can gain from postdoc before joining an industry?
So my answer to that would be as broad of the widest breadth of experiences that you can get. Again, how do you make me money or save me money? And that's because you've seen a broad array of different applications, techniques, ways of problem solving. And so I think, you know, having that breadth would be great. Getting an idea of what are the problems that are unique and relevant to industry. And we've got great examples locally like BALSA that can help you actually learn about what does the private sector face, especially what do new startups face. So I think getting as much experience with that, because a lot of people, I always kind of laugh about folks that will say, I'm going to be a consultant and I'm going to come out of grad school and become a consultant. And the question is, who's going to pay you for that experiences that you have? And so something like BALSA is actually an example where they've actually done it. But for the most part, I, for example, only became a consultant within the past year. And so getting that breadth of experiences is really, really important. And so the best way to do that is by getting as many different experiences as you can.
But I don't think that you have to do a postdoc. And I think that's what you were asking. I mean, we certainly know a number of our PhD students who go right into industry. And the people that I'm thinking of who went to Sigma, I don't know that any of them did postdocs. And then I also know of students who finished and went to a big consulting company like McKinsey. And I don't really know what they did. You know, they're not allowed to tell you, right? You know, Pete Buttigieg is not allowed to tell you what he did at McKinsey, but they seem to be happy, you know, on the face of it.
I would reiterate that too. You certainly don't need a postdoc. Actually, my own example, I left graduate school and I went right into industry. So I graduated at the end of the month, and 2 weeks later I was at GSK. So you don't have to have that
There's also a lot of biotech companies that have postdoc programs. So an industry postdoc program, Genentech, Regeneron, Johnson & Johnson, Janssen, they all have postdoc programs.
And there, keep in mind that in some cases, if you are in a company-based postdoc program, they're not allowed to hire you. That's actually a provision of a lot of these different companies. So if you're going someplace to be there for the rest of your life, that's not the way to do it. But it is good to get the experience, and then you can go somewhere else.
Yeah, that's true.
Sorry, I just want to push back on that a little bit. I was just involved with the UIDP Industry Postdoc Program Guide, where we talked to about 5 different people who run postdoc programs. And they actually retain most of their postdocs into full-time positions, or they go to a different industry company. But it's a good experience if you want to learn about what industry is like, what the culture is like, if that's a fit for you.
Yeah. I would agree with Mike, though, about that. And again, having been in industry and seeing industrial postdocs come through, these are some extraordinarily talented people. But in the companies I work with, they generally did not hire the postdocs. And the reason is that, you know, if they started hiring postdocs and you weren't one of them that they hired, it's a full-time position, then all of a sudden you've got a bit of a dark cloud hanging over you. People are going to ask, well, gee, you know, he was at a great company. Why didn't they pick him up? Now you can say, well, they didn't have a job opening or this or that, but there's still a little bit of cloud. So I would be very careful about industrial postdocs. I do agree, great place to get some experience and learn the culture, but don't plan on being there. All
right, well, it's 5:03 and we don't want to keep you any longer. Again, thank you to everybody on our panel. I thought the presentations and all the information was really great. And thank you all for staying on a Friday. John?
And I want to thank you. I want to thank Melissa. She organized this. She did all the work. As you noticed, I didn't even show up at the start. So I had something that I had to be at. So I'm sorry I was late, but Melissa asked me, like, is this okay? Should I just do it? I'm like, yeah, you know, you do it. Of course.
Yeah, so, well, the setting it up was the easy part. Y'all had to present. So thank you so much. And thank you for those that attended. I believe next Friday is a recruitment day. So there might be information from the program on whatever events that they'll be holding. So just pay attention to your email because you all want to participate in recruiting more students. Right. So have a great weekend. And once again, thank you all.
Happy hunting.